400 feet beneath the Sea of Okhotsk, inside Soviet territorial waters, an American machine is wrapped around a Soviet military cable. Not a probe, not a sensor, a recorder. Water 1 degree above freezing. Divers stepping out of a submarine onto the sea floor. 6 tons of machinery running on a nuclear power source. Tapes carried up by hand, year after year, in enemy waters. Here is the part nobody tells you. Every word on that cable goes out in plain language. No code, no cipher, nothing at all. Because a cable lying on the bottom of your own sea cannot be tapped. They were right. That is exactly why the Americans came. It runs for 9 years. The Soviet Union never detects it. Not once. Not a suspicion. Not a single test that comes back wrong. And it is not Soviet intelligence that ends it. It is one man in Washington who is $65,000 in debt. You will hear his name. Not yet. In 1970, the United States Navy had a blind spot the size of a country. On the Kamchatka Peninsula, on the far eastern edge of the Soviet Union, sat Petropavlovsk, the main base of the Soviet Pacific submarine fleet. Ballistic missile submarines sailed from there into the Pacific, carrying nuclear weapons aimed at American cities. And the United States knew almost nothing about what those submarines were doing, how often they sailed, or what state they were in. The problem was not a lack of listening. It was that there was nothing to listen to. Radio can be intercepted. Radio was encrypted and heavily. The Soviets were not careless people. The man who found the way in was Captain James Bradley, Jr. Since 1966, he had run undersea warfare for the Office of Naval Intelligence, which in practice meant he was the man who thought up ways to put American submarines where they were not supposed to be. The story Bradley told afterwards, and this is his account, not a document, is that the idea came to him at night, and that it came from his childhood. He had grown up near the Mississippi, and along the Mississippi, wherever a cable ran under the water, the river authorities put up a sign on the bank. Cable crossing. Do not anchor. Every country in the world does this, because the alternative is a fishing boat dropping an anchor through a communications line and cutting a city off. So, Bradley asked the question that nobody had asked. Petropavlovsk is on an island-like peninsula. Its headquarters is on the mainland. There is no land route worth speaking of between them. If those two places talk to each other, and radio is not the only way they talk, then somewhere on the floor of the Sea of Okhotsk there is a cable. And if there is a cable, then somewhere on a Soviet beach, there is a sign telling people not to anchor near it. The Sea of Okhotsk is roughly the size of France and Spain put together. Bradley proposed sending a submarine into it, inside Soviet territorial waters, to look for a signpost. The submarine chosen for it was USS Halibut. On paper, Halibut was an old and slightly embarrassing vessel, a first-generation missile boat whose missiles had been made obsolete almost immediately. In reality, she had been quietly rebuilt into something with no equivalent anywhere in the world. She carried a compartment the crew called the Bat Cave, cameras that could be towed along the sea floor, and a chamber from which men could leave the submarine while she was submerged and come back. She also carried a cover story, and it was a good one. If she were detected, Halibut was searching for the debris of a Soviet SS-N-12 anti-ship missile to help the Americans build countermeasures against it. That story was plausible. It was the kind of thing a submarine really would do, and it explained everything except the truth. In October 1971, she went into the Sea of Okhotsk. She hugged the coast. Not to hide, although she was hiding, but to look. Somewhere along that shoreline there had to be a sign. They found it. A weathered board on an empty beach, in Russian, warning ships not to drop anchor because of the cable. From the sign, the search narrowed from an entire sea to a single line on a chart. Within days, Halibut's cameras found it. A cable lying uncovered on the sea floor, 400 feet down. Nobody was guarding it. Nobody had ever imagined it would need guarding. Here's the part that is hard to picture. The divers on Halibut were not scuba divers. At 400 feet, a man cannot simply swim down and come back up. The pressure would kill him on the way. So they lived under pressure. Their compartment inside the submarine was pressurized to match the depth outside for days at a time, so that their bodies were permanently equalized with the sea floor. Saturation diving. When it was time to work, they opened a hatch and stepped out into the Sea of Okhotsk. The water there is close to freezing. A man in it loses consciousness in minutes. So each diver was connected to the submarine by an umbilical, a bundle of lines carrying his breathing gas, his communications, and hot water pumped continuously through his suit to keep him alive. If the umbilical failed, he had very little time. They walked to the cable, and they attached a device about 20 feet long that wrapped completely around it. It did not cut the cable. It did not touch the conductors inside. It read the signal through induction, sensing the electrical field leaking through the insulation, the same way you can hear a radio through a wall. There was nothing to find, no splice, no break, no change in the line. A Soviet engineer testing that cable from either end would see a perfectly healthy circuit. The device had one more feature, and it tells you how carefully these people thought. It was built to fall off. If the Soviets ever raised that cable for repair, the recorder was designed to detach and drop back to the sea floor rather than come up in their hands. Then, Halibut left and came back, and the divers went out again and brought up the first tape. And what was on it was almost disappointing in its ordinariness. Officers talking, routine traffic, supply requests, personnel matters, birthday wishes. In the clear, unencrypted, every word. Because why would you encrypt a landline at the bottom of your own sea? If this is the kind of history you came for, the operations that were only ever written down in files nobody expected to be opened, then stay with me. Because the way this one ended is stranger than the way it began. What followed was one of the strangest routines in the history of intelligence work. Roughly once a month, and later on a longer cycle, an American submarine sailed into Soviet territorial waters, found a specific point on the sea floor, put men over the side into freezing water, swapped a tape, and went home. The intelligence was extraordinary. Not decrypted fragments, not inference. The actual daily conversation of a Soviet fleet in plain language about what it was doing and what it was worried about. So the Americans invested. Bell Laboratories built a new generation of recorder. The later pod was powered by a radioisotope thermoelectric generator, a nuclear power source, the same principle used on deep space probes, and it could hold a full year of recordings before anyone had to come for it. The first device had weighed around 300 pounds. The pod that replaced it weighed about 6 tons. The men who worked with it called it the Beast. Think about what that means. The United States installed a 6-ton nuclear-powered machine on the floor of a Soviet sea, and then serviced it, on a schedule, for years, while the Soviet Navy sailed over the top of it. And in Moscow, nobody knew. Not a suspicion, not a rumor, nothing. Until the autumn of 1981, when an American reconnaissance satellite photographed the Sea of Okhotsk and found something that should not have been there. Soviet ships, a group of them, holding position, directly over the tap. The submarine, USS Parsh, was sent to find out what had happened. She went to the coordinates, she searched the sea floor, and she found the cable exactly where it had always been, undamaged, working normally. The recorder was gone. Not damaged, not detached and lying in the silt where it was designed to fall. Gone. Something weighing 6 tons had been located on the floor of the sea, at 400 feet, in an area the size of 2 European countries, and lifted out, which meant the Soviets had not stumbled across it. You do not stumble across a cylinder on the seabed. You do not find it with sonar, you do not find it by accident, and you certainly do not find it while sailing past on the surface. Somebody had told them the coordinates. For the American side, this was the worst possible category of failure, because it was invisible. The operation was over, but the reason it was over was walking around somewhere, holding a security clearance, and there was no way to know who. It took 5 years to find out. His name was Ronald Pelton. He was 44 years old. He had spent about 15 years inside the National Security Agency. He spoke fluent Russian. He was, by every account, competent and unremarkable. A man who knew a very great deal and was noticed by almost nobody. And he was broke. Not dramatically broke. Broke the way ordinary people are broke. He owed around $65,000, which in today's money is something over $250,000. 3 months before he resigned from the NSA, he filed for bankruptcy. In January 1980, he walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. He carried nothing. No documents, no film, no copied files. Nothing that could be found on him, and nothing that could be traced back through a registry. He had simply spent 15 years listening to secrets, and he remembered them. Over the next 3 years, the KGB paid him around $35,000 in total. For Operation Ivy Bells specifically, for the coordinates of a 6-ton nuclear-powered recorder sitting on the floor of the Sea of Okhotsk, and the knowledge that it existed at all, he was paid $5,000. $5,000. What finally exposed him was not American counterintelligence. It was a Soviet officer having second thoughts. In 1985, a senior KGB officer named Vitaly Yurchenko defected to the United States. During his debriefing, he described, without knowing the man's name, a former NSA employee who had sold the Americans' undersea operation to Moscow. That description was enough for the FBI to work backwards to Pelton. And then Yurchenko did something almost nobody in the history of the Cold War has done. He changed his mind again. He walked out of a restaurant in Washington where his CIA minders were sitting, went to the Soviet embassy, and redefected back to the country he had just betrayed. He then denied much of what he had said. By then, it did not matter. The FBI had what it needed, and confirmation came from another source. Ronald Pelton was arrested in 1986 and convicted of espionage. He was sentenced to 3 life sentences plus 10 years. He served 29 of them. He was released in November 2015, an old man, into a country that had almost entirely forgotten who he was. He died in September 2022, aged 80. Operation Ivy Bells ran for 9 years. It was, by the standards of the trade, close to perfect. It was invisible from the surface, invisible from the shore, invisible to every test a Soviet engineer could run on his own cable. It could not be detected by any technical means available to the other side, and it never was. It was ended by a man in debt. The Americans went back, incidentally, other cables, other seas. The program did not stop, it moved. Most of what came after is still classified, and will be for a long time. But the first one, the 6-ton cylinder from the Sea of Okhotsk, was hauled up, carried across a continent, and put on display in Moscow, where it has sat ever since as a trophy. A piece of American engineering that beat every defense the Soviet Union had, and lost to $5,000. The people who walk past it don't stop. There is no sign explaining what it did, or how it was found, or who told them where to look. That is what this channel is for. the objects and the files that are sitting in plain sight with the explanation removed. Subscribe, and I'll keep opening them.